we're talking about prices going up for not just gas and milk, but like all the goods of things that people normally pay for on a day-to-day are going up. And that is a reflection of this inflationary time that we're living in. No matter what the Fed is doing thus far, have not been able to really, slow that down very, very much. When I think of that, I think of the average resident who we're talking about, right? Like their cost of living is going up all around them. Would you think that that means that they wouldn't be able to afford higher rents? What happens during these times for these residents?
Yeah, so one might have a hunch and they might think, well, if these residents, these renters are paying more for all of these consumer goods and everything else, aren't they going to get squeezed if they have to pay more for rent? What I like to do, it's easy to have a hunch, is take a look at history. What happens historically? We kind of have a guidebook for what happens in these situations. And when we take a look at history over hunches, yeah, Pablo, if you want to bring up that first chart that I shared with you the other day, how do rents move in a high inflation environment? Let's look to the 1970s. And by the way, this spans 1974 to 1985. So it was about 40 years ago. That's the last time we had a high inflation environment. And as you can see, the result, rents went up 7 to 12% every single one of those years, all 11 years from 1974 to 1985. Okay, the last high inflation period that we had. And this is a really germane period for us to borrow a lesson from, because there were also 3 economic recessions during this period. And many think we're descending into recession now. Some think that we're there already. So rents went up 7 to 12% each and every one of these years during high inflation. And by the way, the historic rent appreciation in the United States over the past 100 years is only about 3%. So if tenants are paying substantially more for rent, how can they afford it in high inflation? Well, rents are exceeding historic norms again today. It's happening again today, which you can begin to see over there at the right of your screen. That went back a few months ago. The latest month-over-month period tells us that apartment rents are up about 9% year over year. That's per Zumper's rent report. And right now, the latest month ended anyway, single-family rents are up 11%. That's per CoreLogic's single family rent index. So that's today, as we kind of think about the right part of that chart there. By the way, it can be difficult to find good rental data for single family homes. So CoreLogic's single family rent index, that's a resource you might want to bookmark or take note of for the future. Again, it's CoreLogic's single family rent index. All right, so this could be a real conundrum to people. Why is this happening? How can rents be soaring at 3 times or so historic norms in this high inflation environment if your tenant's getting squeezed for everything else? And really, there are at least 3 reasons for this. So say you, as a real estate investor, say you're contemplating raising the rent on your resident from $1,600 up to, let's say, $1,800. All right, that's a 12.5% rent increase. You want to raise it from $1,600 up to $1,800. How are you doing that? How have people been getting these rent increases today? Because rents are up 9 to 11% now. And really, one needs to remember that the market is not static. So for the class of housing that you provide to people, there are people moving into that class and there are people moving out of that class of housing all the time. So really, the first reason that rents go up faster than historic norms during high inflation is a lot of times renters step down a class. So a renter might have been paying $2,500 a month for, say, a Class A, which means the best type of housing unit, and they might have to get more austere and step down to a $1,600 to $1,800 rent to pay your $1,800 of rent. So renters often step down. And maybe you're thinking, well, wait, wouldn't that result in a diminished quality of life for that person? Well, yeah, that's what happens during an economic slowdown. So
Yeah,
really, that's the first place of 3 that they come from.
that makes a lot of sense. We've talked a lot on this show about the idea that this asset class seems to be more resilient than others. And when I say this asset class, I mean specifically workforce housing, right? The idea that if you are renting like a luxury home or another class of rental home, then you are making the conscious decision to spend discretionary income on rent to live a certain lifestyle. And when times get hard, that discretionary income goes away from other places and into workforce housing, right? Like whether you're spending money in the market, you put it back in your housing and you're doing this stuff. So it provides this idea that the lower socioeconomic regions of the market, they strive for this to be in this type of home. And the couple notches above, it's a retreat point to them. So there's always this like steady demand in this asset class is kind of what you're saying, right?
Yeah, and you brought up a beautiful point, Pablo. You refer to this as workforce housing. Generally for long-term rentals, so we're just talking about long-term rentals in this conversation, not short-term rentals like Airbnbs and VRBOs. Typically luxurious and beautiful housing doesn't tend to be profitable, and it doesn't tend to leave you with a place for people to step down to. So you want there to be a place for people to step down to during recessionary times or for people to step up to during good times. So that's why oftentimes you want to invest in a real estate market where you're buying something just below the median purchase price. That tends to be a sweet spot for profitability, as well as people being able to step down from somewhere in times like this or to step up from somewhere else. And another reason that rents can increase during times of high inflation and a recession is that more roommates tend to double up. Now, this is something you need to be careful for as a real estate investor and make sure that your lease is written, however it's written with regard to visitors staying no more than 7 days, because in lean times, this is what can happen. But that's another way that renters can weather these rent increases. And understand, though, that during the global health crisis that began a couple years ago, we saw a decoupling trend. Okay, roommates tended to decouple. And will they really group up or pair up as much as they did, say, 40 years ago when we looked at that chart a little bit earlier? I don't know. It was Mark Twain. Mark Twain's actually attributed with a quote you've heard many times: history doesn't often repeat, but it often does rhyme. That's actually attributed to Mark Twain. Another Mark Twain quote. It seems like everything's attributed to either Mark Twain or Benjamin Franklin. Or if you don't know who said it, just say Mark Twain or Benjamin Franklin, and everyone will believe you. But that one really is
Those guys are pretty good with
attributed
words.
to
Pretty
Mark
good
Twain. But I don't know if there will be as much grouping up this time around. And that is because the work from home trend has become pretty pervasive. A lot of people can't still work from home, but working from home, that necessitates more space. So therefore, this coupling trend might be reduced, not just as much as it was before. But that really is the second way that tenants can afford to pay substantially more for rent during times of inflation and a recession. And then really the third way, and really the way oftentimes that residents have to pay more for rent, is this chronically low housing supply we've had. There are a lot of ways to measure this and a lot of metrics and statistical sources, but many think we need twice as much available housing now just to adequately house the number of Americans that are in the United States. Our population is now 1/3 of a billion, and they have all got to live somewhere. So with this low housing supply, in some markets, prospective tenants are even offering gifts to landlords for a place to rent. Now, personally, I haven't had that happen to me in any of my rentals, but that just shows you this low supply, high demand dynamic. So really, those are the three reasons that rents have stepped up faster than historic norms in inflation and a potential recession. Number one is that renters move down a class. Number two is that more renters double up. And then thirdly, this low housing supply coupled with sustainable demand. That's why it's been happening.
Interesting, man. Interesting.